It's great to be with you. I'm going to apologize in advance because I've got a wife who's working virtually and two kids who are in virtual school, and occasionally my screen says unstable internet. So if at any point I freeze, maybe it's fitting that an update from Congress involves the words unstable. I will also mention I did, even though these are very challenging times, get to start my morning with kind of a kick. My daughters are in virtual school. I think we have the two kids that may be the only kids in their class who actually dressed up for Halloween for their virtual school today. My eldest daughter is dressed as Jessica Fletcher from Murder, She Wrote. My daughter is obsessed with that television show. So I thought you would get a kick out of that. It's good to see everybody. I wish we could be doing this in person. I know we did last year in person, and I missed that. And obviously, our world has gone very virtual in large part because of this pandemic. I think it's important to ground the conversation in some data. In our state, we've now seen over 104,000 confirmed cases, more than 2,300 deaths from this, 1,500 cases and 22 deaths in Kitsap County alone. And I think that's frankly why you've seen, you saw 4 relief packages that passed with bipartisan support out of the gate to help small businesses, to help medical providers, to help frontline workers. But it's pretty clear to me that folks are still struggling and that far more action is needed. So let me sort of disaggregate the pieces of where I think that help needs to come. One is we've got to crush this virus. And, the reality is, I think the greatest shortcoming that you've seen in terms of the federal government's response is not adequately having a strategy for crushing this virus. You can go back to February. Senator Murray and I joined with 50 of our colleagues, Democrats and Republicans, calling on the Centers for Disease Control and the administration to ramp up testing capacity. Because if you look at the nations that have gotten a handle on this, they've had a coordinated national testing strategy. So you can figure out, okay, who's got this virus? If someone tests positive, they can isolate. You do contact tracing to see who they've been in touch with, and then put those folks who might be positive, encourage them to quarantine. And that's really what's worked in the nations that have gotten a handle on this. And unfortunately, you simply have not seen a good enough job of that out of the United States. Experts suggest that we should have more than 5 million tests run nationwide per day. We are at about 900,000 tests per day as a country. So we're, less than 20% of where we need to be. That's part of the stalemate that you see on this most recent response bill. The House back in May passed a bill called the HEROES Act, which would enable us to have the testing capacity, contact tracing capacity to crush this virus. And unfortunately, we've seen pushback from the administration on embracing that strategy. On top of that, obviously, we've seen the most significant economic disruption since the Great Depression. Our economy went into a medically induced coma for a bit, and even now a number of businesses are still really struggling. And that's my background. I worked in economic development professionally, so a lot of my focus is also on trying to help our economy recover from this. The House, in the bill that it passed that is waiting on action in the Senate, included another round of the Paycheck Protection Program, as well as something called the Employee Retention Tax Credit, to try to help our small businesses on Main Street just get through this. And, unfortunately, again, we've not seen anything pass the Senate, let alone anything adequate, even considered in the Senate. But I think it is really important. And if I had to speculate, I think you will see something, hopefully within the next month, that will make it across the finish line and get help to folks who need it. On top of that, one of the areas of disagreement is funding for state, local, and tribal governments. Unfortunately, because of the downturn in our economy, you've seen a significant downturn in projected revenues for state, local, and tribal governments. And that's problematic on a few fronts. One, the federal response, because you've lacked that sort of federal coordinated strategic response, it's largely been deferred to or devolved to the state and local governments, which means that they are facing additional costs while they're dealing with lower revenues. So they're seeing very substantial revenue shortfalls and projected deficits. Every municipality that we've spoken with, including the city of Bainbridge Island, is dealing with projected shortfalls. The state of Washington is predicting I think a $4.5 billion shortfall over the next 3 years. And we just did a roundtable with a group of community college leaders, and they've been told by the state to prepare a budget to cut 15 to 20% out of their college budget. So what that means is layoffs. That means that services that we're going to depend on to grow out of this economic downturn aren't going to be provided in the way that we need them to be. So that is very concerning. And so the HEROES Act, the bill that passed out of the House, not just in May, but passed again earlier this month, includes support for state, local, and tribal governments. This, as you may have heard in the press, is an area of disagreement. If you watch the presidential debate, you heard the president say, we're not going to bail out blue states. I want to make clear what we're talking about here. This is not about bailing out blue states. In fact, if you look at the 15 states with the largest projected shortfalls, 8 of the 15 are red states. But I guess I'll add, who cares? We're all the United States of America, and I believe part of the role of the federal government is not to turn a blind eye to those states that, in the absence of federal support, are going to be looking at very dramatic cuts. And here's the other thing. If we see those very dramatic cuts, and this isn't Derek Kilmer saying this is the chair of the Federal Reserve, it will exacerbate our economic downturn, because you'll see a bunch of public sector employees get laid off on the heels of the private sector layoffs that we've already seen. I will tell you, we've seen that already happen. We've got school districts in our district that have already done layoffs. The city of Tacoma has already laid off over 300 employees. So this could really have a significant impact on our economic recovery as well. There's some other stuff I can talk about related to the pandemic. I will tell you that so much of the focus has been on just trying to stop the bleeding, to provide rental assistance, to provide nutrition assistance, to provide help for folks who are really hurting. And again, I don't say this in a partisan way. I just want to arm you with fact. This has again been part of the disagreement. My team and I met with a group of food banks. They're seeing, unfortunately, just record demand for their services. I talked with a woman in Port Angeles earlier this month, and she said, I worked my entire life. And she said, and I got laid off in March, and she said, I can't find a job. And she said, I used to organize the food drive for my business. And she said, for the first time in my life, I went to the food bank because I couldn't feed my kids. And that story is unfortunately happening all over our state, all over our country. And so we're seeing substantial need. I mentioned this, the HEROES Act that passed the House in May and then again in October included $69 billion for assistance for nutrition, for food banks, for the SNAP program, and also funding for utility assistance so people don't see their power cut off for something that's not their fault. I contrast, and again, I'm not saying this as to lob a partisan bomb. I just want to give you a sense of why it's been difficult to get to an agreement. The House bill included $69 billion for that purpose. The Senate bill included $250,000 for that purpose. $250,000. That is not enough money to handle the nutrition needs of Kitsap County, let alone of the entire United States of America. And so I am someone who has a sense of urgency about trying to get to an agreement because I have a lot of constituents who are hurting right now. But I share that with you just to give you a sense of why an agreement has been hard to come by, because I think what you're seeing is a real difference in values. I think it's important that people not lose their housing or go hungry for something that's not their fault. And that's been part of the House response to this. I mentioned that so much of the focus has been on stopping the bleeding. At some point, I think you're going to need to see some focus on how do we get our economy up off the ground. I'm hopeful that that includes a discussion around infrastructure. The House actually passed a bill called the Moving America Forward Act that would include investments in roads and bridges, in transit, in modernizing our power grid, and also something that I've been working very hard on, and that is the issue of expanding broadband access. We learned, I think, over the course of the pandemic that access to the internet is almost like rural electrification was in generations past. It's to me, accessing the internet is not just about whether you can watch the new Borat movie on Amazon Prime. It's, can your kid keep learning if school went virtual? And can you keep operating your business if your storefront got shut down? And unfortunately, for a whole lot of the people I represent, the answer to that is they can't. And so that's been something that I've been working on. We introduced, even before this pandemic, a bill called the Broadband for All Act to try to address that. Before I wrap up, I want to just highlight a few other things that I'm working on, acknowledging that that this is the senior center. I think part of our economic recovery also needs to focus on making sure that seniors can retire with dignity. I'm a sponsor of a bill called the Social Security 2100 Act, which does a number of things to try to strengthen Social Security. First, importantly, would extend the solvency of our Social Security system past the year 2100. It would improve the cost of living adjustment formula so that as we see inflation, that seniors are protected. Right now, the COLAs don't adequately address the actual costs that seniors face, and I'm happy to talk more about that if folks want to. It would also raise the minimum benefit for Social Security recipients. And it does all this, simply put, by asking the very, very wealthiest Americans to pay more into the system. I'm also a sponsor of a bill called this has the best title of any bill in Congress, I think. It's called the Seniors Have Eyes, Ears, and Teeth Act. And explicitly, it would expand Medicare to cover vision and hearing and dental. We lost my grandma last year. She was 13 days shy of her 109th birthday, which is pretty amazing. I hope I have those genes. But I saw up close and personally as she aged, so did her eyes and ears and teeth. And, currently Medicare doesn't sufficiently provide help for seniors in that regard. And so I'm a sponsor of that bill. I also just want to mention the House passed a bill that I'm a supporter of called the Lower Drug Costs Now Act that would, for the first time, allow Medicare to negotiate for lower drug prices. And it's a big deal, and it saves a lot of money, a lot of money. Frankly, not just for seniors, but because we extend it not just to Medicare, but to the rest of to commercial insurance as well. It's projected to have just a dramatic increase on people's out-of-pocket expenses, particularly for seniors. And it saves a whole lot of money for the federal government too, if you're able to basically do that kind of bulk purchasing and bulk price negotiation. So I know I covered a lot. I guess the only final thing I want to share with you is I know it's challenging to watch. I can't watch cable news anymore, certainly not within an hour of eating. And a large part of my approach has been simply trying to bring more civility to our politics. I chair a group in Congress called the Bipartisan Working Group, which is a group of a dozen Democrats and a dozen Republicans who meet weekly for breakfast, and try to figure out where we can find some common ground. And I'm happy to talk more about that group's efforts. I also was asked in this Congress to chair a new committee in Congress. I'm the youngest committee chair in Congress, and I chair a committee called the Select Committee on the Modernization of Congress. It was nicknamed the Fix Congress Committee. Very quietly, without a lot of press attention, we have passed nearly 100 reforms focused on making Congress work better for the American people. And I'm happy to talk more about that too. But I want to give you just a sense that there are some efforts to try to dial down some of the rancor and hopefully just get stuff done for the American people. And I'm active in that. You probably won't see that on cable news because that's not the type of thing that they cover. But I do want you to know that there are efforts like that underway, and I'm a part of them. So why don't I stop there? I'm happy to answer questions, comments, concerns, compliments. Really, I'll take anything at this point.
So I invite you to open up your microphone if you do have a question for Congressman Kilmer, and keep your question brief so everybody has a chance to field a question if they have one. I'll start by asking a little bit about, you said something about the your bipartisan efforts, which I know we talked a lot about the last time we checked in with you. And then you put that against some of the challenges in getting any relief out of COVID-19. I'm wondering, from the federal government regarding both support for testing and PPE and businesses, economic support. And you did say something about how you thought that maybe in the next month something might cross the finish line.
Yeah.
Based on your conversations with like-minded bipartisan folks, do you have any idea what shape that might take?
Yeah. I think it's not going to look that far off from what the House passed in early October, frankly. We're still working out some of the details, but the House proposal focused on, one, trying to protect lives by crushing this virus, and two, trying to protect livelihoods by helping small businesses and nonprofits, and by helping families with things like housing assistance and nutrition assistance, and extending unemployment benefits with some help from the federal government. That employee retention tax credit, I'm pretty confident, will be part of a deal as well, and another round of the Paycheck Protection Program. There are some, as I mentioned, there are some holdups and some areas of disagreement. The funding for state, local, and tribal government is probably the most significant area of disagreement. And then there's some more nitty-gritty details about, so for example, if we provide housing assistance, there's some discussion around who should be eligible for it. But I think those issues can get worked out. Frankly, I don't want to speculate about what has helped. Part of the difficulty here is that in May, the House passed a comprehensive COVID bill. And at that time, and I don't say this to be partisan. I think you all have a sense of me. I'm not a big partisan bomb thrower. That at that time, Mitch McConnell said, well, let's just pause, rather than dealing with more legislation, let's just pause. And unfortunately, the virus didn't pause, right? We've seen thousands and thousands of Americans continue to die, and we've seen millions and millions of Americans lose their jobs. And so while the Senate approach was to pause, unfortunately, we've seen continued havoc wreaked throughout our country. We didn't even see the Senate vote on anything until I think September. And even then, it's just been very, and again, I try not to sort of malign intent, right? But the starting point when the Senate put its proposal on the table was they had $1 trillion package. The House is at 2.2 trillion. Rather than coming closer, they then voted on a $500 billion package. So that's not my understanding of how, good faith negotiations go, right? So again, I'm just trying to give you a little bit of a peek behind the curtain on why this has been difficult to get to an agreement.
Yeah, and I remember when we used to hear a lot about conference committees where you'd get a bill passed in the House, you get a bill passed in the Senate, and then you try to find common ground. You don't hear about that kind of work going on now, right? Am I right about that?
It happens in some instances, so for example, there will be a conference committee on the defense bill as an example, which certainly has implications for Kitsap County. But it doesn't happen enough. It doesn't happen enough, and there's a whole bunch of things that the House has passed that, rather than, as you mentioned, getting a vote in the Senate and then working out the differences, they just sit, right? They just sit there. We passed a big, bold campaign finance reform bill that hasn't even gotten a hearing in the Senate. We passed an infrastructure bill that hasn't even gotten a hearing in the Senate. The prescription drug bill that I mentioned, same thing. We passed a new Voting Rights Act to address some of the voter suppression that you're seeing in our country. That also hasn't gotten any attention in the Senate. We passed a bill to expand LGBTQ protections in matters of housing and employment, something the state of Washington has already done. That hasn't even gotten a hearing in the Senate. We passed a bill to expand universal background checks for the purchase of a weapon so that we don't see so many mass shootings in this country. That hasn't even gotten a hearing in the Senate. We passed a bill to re-enter the Paris Climate Agreement and to try to address climate change. That hasn't even gotten a hearing in the Senate. So I share this again, not to be partisan, but just to give you a sense of, there's a whole bunch. And again, I feel like even that litany of things that I just listed, I don't know that most, even people who follow the news, I'm not sure most Americans know all of that, right? That know that those things have passed, but unfortunately have languished on Mitch McConnell's desk.
Right, and that's not a function, I'm guessing, of the people that you know in the Senate who are Republicans entirely, but the leadership itself sort of trying to organize. Is that fair to say?
I think that's probably fair to say.
Okay, I want to make sure if there are any other questions, people have an opportunity to ask them or comments. Or as Congressman Kilmer said, compliments, maybe even a brickbat or
That was
two.
a joke. I'm not fishing.
I know. Okay, well, I guess the only other question. Yeah. Oh, go ahead, Janet, please.
Reid, I would please like to say thank you to Derek for his ability to bring people together, because we seem so divided at the moment.
Yeah. Thank you.
And we live in a bubble, particularly on Bainbridge Island, where we don't see that as much as we could do. Yes, we see it in the news, but to be out on the front line is so much harder.
Thanks.
Yeah.
I will say it's one of the things I think our country is going to have to get a handle of, because I always find myself, when we have these meetings with the bipartisan working group, I always feel like it's the best hour of my week, because I feel a bit like good democracy is a little bit like a good marriage. You don't necessarily agree with your partner on everything, but you got to be able to talk to each other and listen to each other and not have every interaction turn into the Jerry Springer show. And, it strikes me that that's important, not just for Congress, but for our country too. Sometimes when my team doesn't know what to do with me, they have me go stand on people's porches and say, "Hey, I'm your congressman. What's on your mind?" And I remember about 2.5 years ago, standing on doorsteps in North Tacoma, and a guy said to me, "I got a question for you." And I said, "Sure." And he said, "Do you know anyone who voted for Donald Trump?" And I said, "Yeah, I know a lot of people who voted for Donald Trump." I said, 3 of the 6 counties I represent voted for Donald Trump. And he said, "You know what? I don't know anybody who voted for Donald Trump." And he said, "I don't even understand that thinking." And I said, "Well, what are you doing about it?" And he said, "Well, it's funny because," he said, "I went on my Facebook page and I said, I would like to go have coffee with a Trump voter because I would like to understand how they think." And I said, "So what happened?" He said, "Well, I had a bunch of my friends call me a traitor, and I had a bunch of Republicans call me a snowflake." And he said, "So I still haven't been able to do it because no one, and so I think there is, particularly coming out of this divided period, and I hope we do come out of this divided period, there is some healing that we need to do, and some of that is trying to get a better understanding of where people are coming from.
Yeah, so
Which is hard.
one of the things that's happened this summer that has been very divisive is this Black Lives Matter movement. And so we are now probably 5 months on from the first time that people went out into the streets to demonstrate. So my question to you is, how do we make that happen so that the various communities, not only Black communities, but people who are not white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, feel more welcome in America?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I actually think that the discussion our country's been having in recent months about racial inequity and racial injustice is really important. And I attended a Black Lives Matter protest on Bainbridge, and I actually think it's really important that communities like Bainbridge, and I live in Gig Harbor, and I attended a Black Lives Matter protest in Gig Harbor too. And these are not massively diverse communities, right, from a demographic standpoint. But the fact that you saw communities coming out and saying, we're going to speak out against racial injustice, whether that's in our criminal justice system, which unfortunately we've seen, whether it's the need to drive reforms in policing, which is important. And frankly, that cannot just be a national Congress conversation. That needs to be a local conversation, whether it's about addressing inequities in our education system, in our healthcare. You need to see, and you're starting to see it, right? You're literally starting to see. I talked with a community college a couple weeks back. The community college leader said to me, "We're having discussions around racial inequity and making sure that all of our students feel welcome that have been a long time coming, and shame on us for not having these conversations sooner." I've talked to law enforcement leaders who have said, you know what? Some of us are afraid of some of the reforms that are being discussed, but there are a lot of these that make a heck of a lot of sense. There are a lot of these reforms that, as a law enforcement leader, they say, yeah, we should have done this already. This is important. I talked with one of the hospitals in the district I represent, and they're having conversations around inequities in our healthcare system. So I think, to answer your question, Janet, like it can't just be a conversation by, elected officials, in marble buildings 3,000 miles from here. I think the conversations that are, and I give a lot of respect to your community, because I think you're trying to drive some of those conversations, and I think it's really important.
Thank you.
So, this is
Richard,
Herbug,
yes.
and I have a question. A number of people and I have observed that not only you, but let's talk about the presidential debate. Trump spoke to his counterpart and accused him of being part of an administration that didn't do things. You avoid bringing up the fact that the Senate has blocked everything. We're all being so nice, but the root of the problem is that nothing is getting done because there's no cooperation whatsoever. And in the estimation of myself and many, many other people, why is there not more disruption about the fact that the problem is due simply to that, or not simply, in great part to that, and to the fact that there are not these conference meetings, and nothing has really been done for decades?
Okay. Thank you. I think that's a good question, and maybe the congressman can answer that, or try.
Well, let me disaggregate that question into a few themes. So one, I guess I'd push back on the notion that nothing has gotten done, right? I mean, under the Obama administration, as an example, you saw the passage of the Affordable Care Act, which unfortunately the Trump administration is trying to repeal. You saw 20 million people get healthcare who previously hadn't had it because something got done, right? You saw forward motion on a whole lot of priorities that I care about under the Obama administration, including protections for dreamers, so that young people who came to this country through no choice of their own aren't facing deportation. Now, again, you've seen the Trump administration try to repeal those efforts. You saw progress made in the passage of a equal pay for Equal Work bill, as an example. So there are things that got done. That is not to say that there hasn't been dysfunction in the legislative branch and a lot of dysfunction driven by the Senate. What I will tell you is, Lincoln, I think, said it best. Lincoln said, public sentiment is everything. With public sentiment, you can accomplish anything, and without it, almost nothing. And so I think part of what you're seeing, and perhaps you will see the outcome of that 4 days from now, is public sentiment trying to drive change to the dynamic that you just raised. You see people who are discontent about the inaction you've seen in the Senate. And I think as a consequence of that, you may see change in the Senate. And because I'm here wearing my official hat, I can't say much more about that from a political context, because I want to stick within the guardrails of our ethics rules. And I don't want either of us to end up in an orange jumpsuit. But hopefully that gives you a sense of.
Well, can you respond maybe to the question of are there risks to being what Richard said was too nice, what you would call bipartisanship, to sort of trying to bridge? And I know that the current Democratic candidate for president, Joe Biden, is talking in a similar way about reaching across the aisle. There are a lot of people who think that might not be effective.
So here's what I'll tell you. I see, Richard, that I have two parts of my job. One is to stand my ground. When there is a attack on our values or on our community, there's not really compromise to be had there. So, for example, when the Trump administration proposed drilling off our coasts, there's no compromise to be had there. I have to fight like heck to try to prevent that. When the Trump administration proposed zeroing out all funding for Puget Sound recovery, there's not a compromise to be had there, right? Like, Puget Sound is a vitally important body of water, not just to our environment, but to our economy and to tribal treaty rights. And, when they propose zeroing out all funding for salmon recovery and for Puget Sound restoration, there's no way to work with that. And so I fight like heck to stop what they're trying to do. And in fact, not only did they not zero out funding for Puget Sound, because I'm on the Appropriations Committee, we increased funding for Puget Sound by double digits. When the Trump administration proposes separating immigrant children from their parents at the southern border, I think that is an absolute violation of who we are as Americans. There is no compromise to be had there. So part of my job is to stand my ground and fight like heck when there is a violation of our values or the interests of the district that I represent. The other part of my job is to work to find common ground when we can, particularly in a period of divided government. For me to get something done for our community, it means I have to do something that passes the House, passes the Senate, and gets signed by a president. And so, for an example, when we increased funding for Puget Sound, that's tough in a period of divided government. But you know what I did? I went and talked with Republicans who represent the Chesapeake Bay and represent the Great Lakes and said, he proposed zeroing you guys out too. Maybe we hitch our wagons together and try to increase funding, not just for Puget Sound, but for those important bodies of water as well. That's how we actually got it done. And it took working with Republicans.
Okay, well, I want to thank you very much. This has been great. I appreciate your time, and we look forward to having you come back and visit us again, provided that you are reelected.
But you can come back even if I'm not Reed.
We are happy to have you here anytime, and as I like to say at these events, membership is just $20 a year. So
can I say one more thing before you give me the hook? I want to respect people's times, but I'm conscious of what Janet asked, and I guess I want to say a couple more things before we wrap up. One, keep the faith. I know it's really hard. This has been a really challenging year, and it can be very easy to get disheartened. And trust me, as someone who represents you in Washington, D.C., there are days where I feel disheartened. But I've kind of made a conscious choice that there's no value in me hand-wringing. on our team, we say, don't agonize, organize, right? We try to direct our angst towards positive purpose. I used to call myself an optimistic person, and then I was given a quote by a rabbi from England who said there is a difference between optimism and hope. Optimism, he said, is a passive virtue. It is the belief that things will get better. He said hope is an active virtue. It's the belief that together we can make things better. He said it doesn't take courage to have optimism, but it does take courage to have hope. And I'm very struck that one of the cool things about our system of government is that we are not passive observers. As President Kennedy said, in our system of government, everybody holds office. And so my encouragement to you is to recognize that your vote, not just your vote, but your voice matters in this process, and that together we can actually make things better. And at least for me, that gives me hope, and I hope it gives you hope as well.
Thank you very much.
Thank
You
you,
bet.
Derek. Thank you so much. You do a great job.
Thank you. Take care, everybody.